Hello, MCU fans. Today we're going to take a look at the question of whether or not there's any difference between timelines and universes. I mean, let's face it, the MCU throws these two terms around left and right. In fact, add in realities. Timelines, universes, and realities seem to be used interchangeably in the MCU. But are they? Is there really any difference? Well, with Loki Season 2 coming right around the corner, it's the perfect time to ask this question. So let's dive right in and see what we can find out. As I like to remind, I am running a contest throughout all of September. All you have to do to enter is be a subscriber, leave a comment. The winner will be announced in early October and can choose from one of the books above. So, best of luck. Okay, one thing I find a little humorous is that Michael Waldron, bless his heart, feels like the logic is crystal clear. He feels that way. I mean, read this interview. He says, I was always very acutely aware of the fact that there's a week between each of our episodes, referring to Loki, and these fans are going to do exactly what I would do, which is pick this apart. We wanted to create a time travel logic that was so airtight it could sustain over 6 hours. There's some time travel concepts here that I'm eager for my Rick and Morty colleagues to see. So he thinks he made it airtight and really, really clear. I'm going to argue that the average fan that went to see, for instance, Quantum Mania is very confused. And I say that because even us superfans, and I consider anyone watching this video a superfan, we're confused. We're still debating what it all meant. The fact that we have to go and read some articles by himself and by Kate Herron, which you're going to see we'll get to, shows the logic wasn't crystal clear. In fact, he doubled down. When Multiverse of Madness came out, which he also wrote, he said, we worked pretty hard on Loki to make it as airtight as possible. But there were times where I was like, I wish I hadn't have defined it so clearly. I don't know why I had to be so specific in my time travel television show about the rules of the multiverse. Oy. Well, he wasn't so specific, and he wasn't really clear. Now, I think it all makes sense. Absolutely. I mean, in fact, the more I look at stuff, and particularly by the time I get done with this video, I hope you feel the same, it is all consistent, and it is clear when it's fully explained. But what he didn't do is put enough in the movies and the shows so that we would understand it. That's why we have to read all these interviews. So that's where ultimately he failed as a writer. You shouldn't have to explain so much of your otherwise crystal clear logic. But, okay, let's first try to tackle this question of, are timelines and universes and realities the same thing? Well, in a Screen Crush article, Michael Waldron pretty much said yes. He said you could literally say they're all different universes, in a way, different timelines. So he's really using the two terms interchangeably. Okay, but what do some of the movies and shows tell us? So this is an interview, and that's helpful. Thank you, Michael Waldron. But what do the movies and shows tell us? Well, let's look at Loki. In Loki, He Who Remains referred to the universes being stacked on top of his own. So in this image here, he's looking at different universes. Keep that in mind. He called them universes. That's where each of the Kangs are located. And then they all got together, they hung out, and using the best of their universes to approve the others. Okay, great. Then he says the multiversal war broke out. And now he says the peace between realities erupted. Well, he's already twice called them universes. So at least in He Who Remains' mind, a universe and a reality are interchangeable. Okay, great. But keep in mind, He Who Remains programmed Miss Minutes, right? And when Miss Minutes described the same multiversal war between different realities, between different universes, Miss Minutes says countless unique timelines battled each other for supremacy. Now, I do realize Miss Minutes is 1,000% propaganda for He Who Remains. But at least this part was truthful. There was a multiversal war, and she referred to it as timelines. So here we now see timelines, universes, and realities all kind of colliding together. He Who Remains then goes on to talk about, discovering Goliath, or someone discovered it. I don't think he did. Notice he says the first variant encountered a creature, and I harnessed it. So I've always thought he didn't actually discover it. Someone else did, and we'll find out who eventually. But more importantly is he weaponized Goliath, and he ended the multiversal war. And then what does he say? He says, once I isolated our timeline. I mean, the very fact that he calls it the sacred timeline. Well, it is a universe, right? I mean, the sacred timeline includes the MCU. In fact, it is the MCU. Now, maybe it branched off at some point to no longer be the sacred timeline, but for the longest time, the MCU was the sacred timeline, and obviously the MCU is a universe. So He Who Remains is clearly interchanging the terms timeline, universe, and reality, and making no distinction whatsoever between them. Okay, how about Bruce and the Ancient One in Endgame? What do they say? Well, the Ancient One says, now this may benefit your reality, and she's referring to Bruce taking the Time Stone, but she says, in this new branch reality. So she's being really clear. He takes the stone, it creates a branch, and that branch is a reality. And we've pretty much seen reality and timeline is, or sorry, reality and universe is the same thing for sure, right? That's just totally interchangeable. So, okay, the branch creates a new reality. So what does Bruce say? He turns right around and says, but we can return each one to its own timeline. So they're talking about the exact same thing here. They're talking about the branch created by removing the stone, and the Ancient One calls it a reality, and Bruce calls it a timeline. They really do seem interchangeable. But let's look at what happened in Quantum Mania. Now, Quantum Mania is even more frustrating because now it throws in alternate dimensions. I really do need to do the video on dimensions. I'm sorry I haven't done that yet. There's a team of people trying to sort through this. And the bottom line is they don't tell us enough to give anything definitive. I mean, dimensions to me is dark dimension, nor dimension. I don't know whether those are, whether there's multiple ones for the multiverse or just one for the multiverse. They don't really answer that question. So that's why we haven't done that yet. But nonetheless, he talks about alternate dimensions. Which dimensions, Hank? Which dimensions are alternate? Nonetheless. Then he says parallel realities. So he's using the term reality. So what does Janet say is Kang's desire? Well, Kang wants to destroy entire worlds, entire timelines. So again, they seem to be interchanging realities and timelines. But who is really the expert on this? Who can we trust if there's no one else we can trust? Who do we turn to? Well, that would be the Watcher. What does the Watcher say? This is fascinating. So the Watcher says, a single choice can branch out into infinite realities. There's that term again. I'm your guide through these vast new realities. So what does he mean? What is a reality then? Okay, in the first episode, the Peggy Carter episode, when he's describing her choice that basically creates a new reality, what does he say? That's the moment that created a new universe. I'm telling you, I think after seeing all of this, because I've never done this analysis before where I really looked at everything I could find, I don't see any difference between a reality, a universe, and a timeline. They just seem to be interchangeable terms. Either that or this is really bad writing, which that's fine. Some people are going to say, well, that's the answer. It's really bad writing. I can accept that, I guess, but I also like to take it, for what it's worth. And the Marvel universe seems to have just use these terms interchangeably. I wish they hadn't. I wish someone would just flat out say it's all the same thing. But they haven't said that. They've instead just used them interchangeably. So tell me what you think. I'd love your opinion, but I think looking at all of this, it seems really clear there's just no difference. And if you think about it, when a decision like Peggy Carter's creates a branch, it has to be an entire universe. It has to be, because in that new branch, in that new timeline, in that new reality, whatever you want to call it, you can go anywhere in the universe. It's an entire universe. So basically, it's a cut and a paste. And that happens infinite times over. It's mind-boggling to think that, but yes, all of these different choices create an entirely new universe, or reality, or timeline. Okay, but there's still something really important to understand about the way these universes, timelines, realities are connected or not connected. So this is something new that I found really fascinating. All right, so to get to it, we need to look at a couple interviews first to remind some of the things that both Waldron and Heron have said. So Waldron, while talking about the sacred timeline, says there's always like different permutations and instances happening. The TVA has their own barometer, their own gauge of what constitutes a deviation from the baseline. Because the baseline is the way it's supposed to go. It's the way it went that produced He Who Remains. That's their baseline. So basically, they have a baseline, but it's important to note, if you zoomed in on the timeline, the sacred timeline, it wouldn't necessarily look like a straight line. It might look like intertwined strands of rope fluctuating and spiking here and there. And again, we see that when you look at the image in Loki of the sacred timeline, that's clearly multiple timelines or universes. or realities. Anyway, he's saying basically there's more than one there. It's not, the sacred timeline isn't just one timeline, it's multiple timelines. And he explains it. He says a Nexus event is basically when it becomes a problem for the TVA, according to their own rules, or maybe we should say He Who Remains rules, is when something could branch off in a way that could actually produce a new timeline that could produce a new version of He Who Remains. That's basically what He Who Remains is trying to prevent. He does not want another Kang. So if a Nexus event doesn't create ultimately another Kang, he's fine with it. It's okay. So you can have Nexus events that don't register, I guess is my point, because every decision, as we saw in What If, every decision is a Nexus event. The question is whether or not He Who Remains wants it pruned. And he's only pruning it when it would create another Kang. He just doesn't want any more Kangs, which I get it, right? He doesn't want another multiversal war. Okay, great. That all makes sense. Also, it's worth noting, Miss Minutes says, what happens when a Nexus event branches past the red line? And Loki says it's when the TVA can no longer reset the Nexus event. That part seems to be true. And then it's kind of propaganda to say, and that would lead to the destruction of the timeline and the collapse of reality as we know it. The real answer is it would create another Kang. It would create another Kang and ultimately another multiversal war. So again, He Who Remains is trying to prevent any Nexus event before it redlines that would ultimately result in another Kang. Great, got it. Again, we only got it because of all these interviews, Michael, but still, excellent. Then, I love this, where Kate Herron said, this is how He Who Remains, isolated the sacred timeline. He Who Remains tells them in his story that he managed to close himself off and isolate the sacred timeline that we all know from the other timelines. It's almost like they're on an island that's completely hidden from everyone. So he didn't destroy the multiverse. He closed the sacred timeline off from it. He isolated them. And Michael Waldron says the same thing. He says the MCU as we know it, Earth 616, was insulated from any multiversal shenanigans. And again, if we look at what He Who Remains said, he said, I weaponized Goliath, I ended the multiversal war, and he didn't do it by killing everybody else. He did it by isolating it. He isolated the timeline from the rest of the multiverse. So the Kang Council is still out there. He's just isolated the sacred timeline, and then he prunes any Nexus events that would create another Kang. Okay, then Kate Herron explains, he isolated their timeline, but now, because of what Sylvie's done, it's almost like it's going to branch, and then those branches are going to build bridges to the other timelines and these other versions of He Who Remains. So that's why now the sacred timeline is reconnecting with the greater multiverse. And that's why the Kang Council is now able to see what's going on in the sacred timeline, which previously they couldn't because it was isolated. Wild. Love it. Okay. And also Michael Waldron, by the way, says the same thing. He says, after the events of the Loki finale, that protection is gone. The multiverse exists, and the universe of the MCU is now part of it. So basically, the MCU is reconnecting to the greater multiverse. Okay. This, though, is really cool. I had never considered this information from the assembled of Multiverse of Madness until now. This is really cool. Michael Waldron says it's impossible, near impossible, to travel from one universe to another. In Loki, you can kind of hop from one timeline branch to another, but you got to be anchored to some original timeline. That's fascinating. I'd never heard that said before, but it makes so much sense. Basically, you can jump to another timeline, but it has to be branched from your timeline. You can't just jump to some random timeline that has no connection to your timeline. And to further make that point, he says what America can do, America Chavez, she can jump from one universe to another. She can literally do the impossible. So for America, it doesn't matter whether they're connected by a branch. She can jump to the cartoon universe, right? As we saw, the noir universe, the fire universe where everything is destroyed. So yeah, that makes sense, right? It all really ties. She can jump between unconnected, unbranched universes. Very, very cool. So that does kind of shed a little more light on what Scott said in his book. I still don't necessarily like the way he's saying it, but maybe this is where Marvel is going. He said we would identify specific recent points on alternate timelines where we knew an Infinity Stone to be, and we would use the quantum tunnel to jump to that timeline. Now, I still think what he's saying is they jumped back in time, created a branch, and ended up in an alternate timeline. But I guess based on what Waldron was saying in Multiverse of Madness, you can jump between timelines as long as they're anchored. Huh. Interesting. Well, either way, it definitely explains how they got back home again, because they were able to make it back to their, their home universe, the universe that they were anchored to. So very cool. Or timeline, remember? Because timeline, universe, they all seem to be the same thing. They can jump back to that anchored timeline. And that's, by the way, how I think Steve Rogers could have gone back in time, created an alternate reality, a branch, and then made it back to his home timeline without even using that time pad that we see in Endgame. He was able to go back to his anchored timeline. Very cool. Plus, in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I know some people don't consider it canon, and that's fine, it still gives us some really good information, so it's worth looking at this. Fitz said, you went back in time, and then you branched off, but we can travel through something called the quantum realm, so we can go in between timelines. But the only reason they could do that is because they were going back to their original timeline, and the two timelines were connected via the branch. Wow. I mean... Waldron, I'm sorry, man. You needed to put some of this information in the actual shows and movies, but I thank him for continuing to drop these, explanations for how this all ties. So let's summarize this, because I really think it's cool, and I think it's important for going into Loki Season 2. So my opinion, tell me in the comments if you disagree, is that universes, realities, and timelines are basically the same thing. They're describing the same thing. He who remains isolated the sacred timeline from the rest of the multiverse, and thus from the Kang Council. So he didn't destroy them, he just hid himself on an island, if you will. Nexus Events create a branch and form a new universe / reality / timeline. Nexus Events can occur due to time travel, which we saw in the Time Heist and we saw in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or via unique decisions, like in What If. You can jump between timelines as long as they're anchored by a branch. America Chavez, on the other hand, can jump between unconnected universes or timelines. The sacred timeline was composed of many timelines, thus there was a multiverse, just a very protected multiverse, and they're interwoven like a rope. He who remains focused only on pruning the Nexus events that would result in a new Kang. That was what he was afraid of. I don't want another Kang in my nice little sacred timeline. And then finally, when He Who Remains died, the unpruned Nexus events created branches reconnecting the sacred timeline back to the multiverse. And thus, that's why the Kang Council was suddenly like, aha, now we know what's been going on in that sacred timeline that was hidden from us all this time. Wow. But I'm telling you, while this all makes sense, it's very logical when you see it all laid out, we didn't get this clearly, or laid out this clearly, in Loki, Multiverse of Madness, What If, Quantumania, etc. So yeah, ultimately that's where I do think Michael Waldron failed in communicating his storyline, but he succeeded in creating a really, really cool set of rules and a really cool way of viewing the multiverse. So let me know what you think. I'd love your feedback. It's fine if you don't agree. Just be specific. Tell me why you don't agree and use the information I've laid out in this video. But still, I don't mind if you disagree. I respond to all the comments. I love hearing from everyone. So now we wait for Loki Season 2. It is right around the corner. I cannot wait. So exciting. Don't forget, we have the contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and we'll pick the winner in October. And of course, we have the Discord server. I always like to bring that up. And here we are in the metaphysics chat, where we all just keep debating, how does this stuff all work? So I love it. It's great to hear all the different conversations. They really stretch me and make me have to think this all through. So yeah, please join the Discord server. I do have a pinned comment with a link in case you want to be part of the conversation. Also, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we can all continue to enjoy the ever-changing, ever-growing Marvel Cinematic Universe.